In association with Get a Tax Rebate, 1895 Sports, Mesa Vienna Aesthetics, CDX Security.
Okay, welcome to the Oddball Woody Show and another episode where, literally this week, I've started ad-libbing this podcast, but this week I've just got a ton of notes that I want to get through because the guest that we've got is a clinical psychologist and she's got a book coming out on the 30th of May called Skewed to the Right, and it's regarding athlete performances and the characteristics that take them to the top and also those characteristics, how they can hinder you post-career in sport. And I was just reading some of the extracts yesterday and just completely nodding my head. So I've made a ton of notes on this one. But it's going to be an interesting one, especially for the guys who want to get a better understanding of retirement after sport. I think there's a huge impact that this could have on them. So I'm pleased to welcome Amy Izychk.
Nearly. We'll take it.
You said don't matter if I get it wrong, didn't you? So
don't worry.
That was the Wigan version. Of it.
We'll take it.
But it is great to have you on. And as I've just said there, the extracts that you sent me of your book that's coming out on the 30th of May, it so resonated with me with so much stuff that you was talking about because you was talking about different contrasts in sport. You spoke about cricket, you spoke about rowing, you even had Luke Stoltman in there, who's Scotland's strongest man and competed at the world's strongest man. And it's very interesting the way that you describe, how the characteristics can take you to the elite. But then we do also have to watch that, these characteristics can be quite hindering as well. I do believe that the majority of sportsmen, from my experience, who I've worked with in the past, are very extreme characters. I can probably name on one hand characters that are quite balanced. The rest of them are very, very extreme in one way or another, and certainly in different ways. But it'd be interesting to have a chat with you, Amy, about that. And do you want to start off with what sort of got you interested into it and a little bit about your background?
Yeah, of course. So I grew up in a sporty family. Me and my brother were both competitive swimmers, but then my main sport was rowing when I got to university. I was studying psychology at the time, and I was invited to become a lightweight rower. And I started to notice certain behaviours that really could have been classified as eating disordered, but because we were in a sporting environment, it was just culturally acceptable. And that felt quite uncomfortable to me. So I didn't stick in it very long and I moved to something more balanced, in your words. I moved more so to recreational rowing after that. But I then continued with my studies with psychology, became a clinical psychologist, did further training in neuropsychology, psychodynamic psychotherapy, which is a specific type of therapy. And throughout that time, I started to work with athletes and elite sports people who were struggling with mental health. And I started to spot a number of patterns in terms of how people were presenting. And I have to say, I think my perspective is probably a bit skewed as well, because of course, if athletes come to me, they are struggling. So I accept that I'm only seeing a certain proportion of athletes. But that being said, I still noticed that certain personality traits were really strong. So, I talk in the book about high levels of obsessionality. high levels of masochism, so pushing through the pain barrier, almost enjoying pain and having to reach that point before a session satisfies the athlete. High levels of aggression. And ultimately, like you say, that these are really helpful traits when you're competing and you're out there in the sporting arena. But then when you retire or when you come off the field, how functional are those traits to other areas of our life? And that's really the book. It's a discussion of what's kind of culturally acceptable within sporting culture, what makes our elite athletes great, but then what's the fallout of that?
Yeah, when you said the word obsession, when you've got that obsession, and I completely relate to that. I'd suffered with obsessive compulsive disorders from being a young kid, from probably around the age of about 13. And I ended up, I started having treatment for it in around 2007, but never really took it that serious. And 2013, I ended up going to the Priory, where I worked with a great doctor called Dr Costas, and he put me on a 12-week programme. And it's the obsessiveness of sport. It's sort of that obsessive compulsive disorder that I had. In some respects, it was a great driver to making me successful. But there was an interesting thing that I read in your book that, being obsessive is quite a strong trait to have as an athlete. But it's when you start flickering light switches on and off throughout the day, and it's ruling the way you live. Well, that was me. That was me going on, flicking light switches on and off, pulling my handbrake up and down, got to park my car a specific way, shutting and closing it a certain amount of times. That was me to a T. And, I found that I was still a bit obsessive once I'd been through the mindfulness and the CBT treatment through the Priory, but it wasn't as excessive. And if anything, I think it helped me performance. And that's why I use the word balance, because it was a more balanced approach. I didn't want to lose that obsessiveness that I had regarding my performance and my drive, but I wanted to lose the social aspect of it that was driving it.
Yeah, and that makes absolute sense. And I think this is what is really challenging for a lot of athletes, that sometimes seeing a clinical psychologist or seeing a professional about this can be quite frightening, because there's an awareness that actually sometimes that obsessionality is really helpful for your sport. And there is this fear that actually if we do move to a more balanced position, or think about how you can switch that on and off, whether or not that's going to enhance your performance, or will it actually mean that it's going to make it worse? And if that's your career, there's a lot more on the line here in terms of accessing help. So it's really encouraging to hear that you've got an experience where actually you found that it was helpful, because that's absolutely my premise. My position is that, we all have mental vulnerabilities. We all have these little traits in us that can get in the way sometimes, but it's like a physical injury, in that if a physio tells you that you've got a fragility in your body, you train to manage that and safeguard that until you're stronger. And I feel it's the same with the mind, that, if we have insight and understanding into how our mind works, we can then also train around that and use that as a strength when we need it, but also manage it when it's actually quite unhelpful.
The characteristics then, do you think that the formed from our experience, or do you think it's sort of, is it nature versus nurture, or are we born like that? Or because I sometimes tell a story about how obsessive. I remember being around about 4 or 5 years of age and being very, very obsessive and very sort of had this perfectionism. And I always remember being about 4 or 5 and having a colouring book, and I had these big Crayola pencil, felt tips. And when I put it on the paper, they would spread. So when they went out the lines, I would screw it up and I'd have to start again because it wasn't perfect. So I asked myself, the question is, from the time I was born to the age I was 4 or 5, however old I was at that point, did I learn that behaviour, or was I naturally just going to be like that?
Yeah. That is a huge question, which we could discuss for hours. But, I'm a psychodynamic psychotherapist, so what that means is that I am interested in the unconscious world and how our developmental experiences shape who we are. Now, that doesn't just mean from when we're born, that also means transgenerationally. So before us, what is it that is passed on to us from our parents as well? And you've spoken about the Luke Stoltman chapter with obsessionality. And there is a lot in that chapter about Luke's heritage, with a Polish grandfather who was a prisoner of war. And there's a real theme of adversity throughout everything that Luke has done. And you can read more about that. But I believe that, we're all born with a certain genetic profile, but of course, our developmental experiences shape that. And then, you're saying from a young age, you had these obsessive behaviours. It's then a chicken and egg with sport that follows. So because of these obsessive behaviours, you're then probably more likely to be drawn to certain things that allow you to manifest those obsessive traits. So, earlier we were talking about how if you're quite an angry child as well, you might be drawn to certain environments which allow you to express that in a socially acceptable way. But then, of course, that maintains that in you and perhaps even exacerbates it. So you then get this chaining effect between what comes first and what comes next. And then it's a feedback loop, really, where those traits are exacerbated.
Yeah, we were speaking earlier about how, I was quite a fiery kid, and I don't know, I like the aggressive side of things. And, I tried every sport I knew when I was growing up, tried swimming, football, but they just didn't quite cut it for me. They wasn't aggressive enough. And then everything else from then, it was either, karate, boxing, kickboxing, Thai boxing, and then it went to rugby league, and rugby league was my main passion. But looking back, after reading the extracts of your book and saying, if you're predispositioned to have aggression, then you're going to be drawn to those sports, because I could never naturally see myself being a cricket player because I just didn't have that temperament. So it's interesting to read that, we do draw ourselves to these environments to bring out these characteristics in us. And that, I suppose that may not even be sport, because not everybody who's got these characteristics are going to become sportsmen.
No, exactly. Yeah. And you might be drawn to, I don't know, anything that facilitates what lives in you, but it's not necessarily going to be sport. It could have been something else. It's just that you were drawn to that, and then it feeds it for you.
Yeah. Just from looking again, going back to your first study, that you did where you had the 8 rowers, the questions that you put to the rowers, I completely understand these quotes that you put in there, that I am my own worst critic. I worry a lot. If others can't do things correctly, I prefer to do them myself. I put my work ahead of being with family or friends or having fun, and I am critical of others. All those statements, I would say the majority of guys who I've worked with in rugby league and other sports, I would say they are very, very common things that they'd identify with.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that was a little piece of research that I did with a lightweight rowing squad. I wanted to understand a bit more, not just about the behaviours that they were engaging in for weight management, but also the personality traits that were attached to that. And the items that you're quoting are from a personality assessment scale. So all of them filled that in. And like you say, those were the items that were loaded the highest by these rowers. And again, there's something about, if an individual relates to themselves in quite a critical way, and they feel that they have to prove something, or there isn't that support outside of themselves, they have to rely on themselves, that's how the individual relates to themselves. Now, that's what's most important, because it doesn't matter what they then go into, they're going to take that character with them. So they might go into, I don't know, architecture, or they might go into business. What they would do is they take that in with them. So they would be critical of everything they were doing in that environment. And they would think that they couldn't rely on their team members. But ultimately what we're saying is that there's something about sport as well. And rowing's a lovely example of a sport that almost glamorizes this ability to be really tough, you know, to be harder than any of the other sports, that, you know, you're up at 5 a.m, you're on the water, you've got blisters and calluses on your hand, you know, and there's almost a bit of pride in saying, I can do this, you know, I rely on myself and I'm my biggest critic, but I'm capable.
Yeah.
So sport was just the vehicle for an individual to express that, really.
Yeah, and it's interesting because those quotes that I said, you know, I am my own worst critic, I worry a lot. A lot of people seem to think that when you're a professional sportsman, whatever you do, you've got like a positive mindset, but they're not actually, that's not exactly a positive mindset, is it? And I think what you're trying to say there is that, you know, it's great to have this driving force and be critical of yourself, but it's when it starts getting too detrimental and you should beat yourself up again. So I'll go back to the word, like I like to use the word balance these days. I suppose it's getting that balance between beating yourself up with a stick every single day and sort of recognising as well when you have done something good.
Absolutely. And you're right to name the importance of balance, because that's what all of this is about. This is about saying, look, these are extreme ways of relating to ourselves. And sometimes you're absolutely right. If you've got an internal critic, that can be brilliant because it drives you on to be a better person and a better player. So that's really helpful. But then, like you say, if you skew to the right too much and you're really high on criticism, then you'll topple over into something where it just becomes really masochistic and nasty and aggressive towards yourself, where it's unhelpful.
Yeah, because there is a picture in the book of the bell shape, and obviously it goes with the title skewed to the right, but you show a diagram in there regarding where elite athletes sit, where average people sit, and then skewed to the right is sort of like that clinical mental illness, I suppose, or, you know, clinical diagnosis. So it's a fine line, isn't it, between being within the average statistic and the clinical side of being diagnosed with a mental illness. It's a tightrope that you're walking by the looks of it.
Yeah, you've hit it spot on. You know, in terms of performing, we need people to be higher than average on these traits. You know, otherwise they'd experience a bit of pain, you know, in the gym or wherever, and they'd think, oh well, I'm quite content, I'm done, you know, and you're not going to get an elite athlete from that. So we do need it to be skewed to the right a bit, but ultimately you then head into the tail end of the bell curve where you're then in the clinically significant zone. And that's the tight end of things where we might fall vulnerable to tipping over into something. So we need to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, can I just read a couple of sentences from something I found really interesting? Because my lad's 13 years of age and he played a rugby game yesterday. And this is sort of something what I was trying to explain to him, because he's got a bit obsessive now with becoming a professional sportsman. And he's sort of gravitating to the MMA, the boxing. He's doing boxing and he's playing rugby as well. So I can see a lot of myself in him. But just this from your book, where it said for the majority, the thought process is very different when experiencing pain during exercise. Instead of thinking push through it, they will more likely think this is getting a bit too much. I think I'll stop. If you stop at the first sight of pain, you're not going to make a good athlete. Similarly, if you push through too much pain, you're not going to make an athlete. This slight difference in personality structure may be able to distinguish between the average and the elite. And, you know, that's basically what we're saying there, is that there's this fine line of getting this, this balance. How can I put this? But because there's a lot of sports people who are diagnosed with mental illnesses in sport, aren't they? But they still seem to excel in their sport. I mean, we only have to go on Google now and put athletes with mental illness, and whether that's depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, addiction, whatever it is. Would you sort of say that it would be more beneficial for an athlete to be more skewed to the right than the average?
Well, gosh, we've got to be careful what we say here, haven't we? I think it is beneficial for them, but it's about not going too far. So let's stick with the example of pain. Okay, so you and I both know, with sporting backgrounds, we're still in it. In order to improve performance, you do have to push through a pain barrier when you're training, whether it's just in strength and conditioning, when you're lifting weights, when you get to max reps, you have to push through that pain in order to improve. Now, that can be helpful to improve performance, but if you tip over too far with pain and enjoying pain, I've got a chapter in the book on masochism with Michelle Bergstrand, who used to be a cyclocross athlete.
Yeah.
And what's happening is that you can go into the depths of physical pain there, where you don't stop if you're injured. And there's almost satisfaction actually with pain. So unless I hit that intensity and I feel that pain, I'm not satisfied. And then what comes after that is I need to feel that pain. Pain allows me to discharge something. So it might be aggression, actually. We see this with people where aggression is turned inwards rather than outwards. And what can happen then is that people can get into the realms of self-harm and bulimia. So that's the extreme version of pushing through pain and starting to enjoy pain. So yes, we need higher than average levels of masochism, because we've got to push through that pain barrier, but we do not need extreme levels of masochism, because ultimately athletes won't stop when they're injured. Potentially we're getting into realms of self-harm, and then that really starts to become quite unhealthy for the individual's well-being.
That's a common trait as well in rugby league, is that when people are injured, it's very rare that they'll put their hand up and let the physio know, or they'll let the coach know, because ultimately the job's on the line, the contract's on the line. They may have to play so many games, and like I said, they are willing to play through that pain barrier quite a lot of the time.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I mean, you've spoken about it yourself as well. I think there's all of those external factors which things get labelled onto, but there's also the internal stuff as well, that actually, if I stop playing, how am I going to discharge this aggression? How am I going to cope with the anxiety that's underneath my obsessions and my need to do this? So as much as there are those external factors that people focus on, you know, I've got a contract, this is my job, it pays for my mortgage. There's also the stuff of, if I have to sit at home on the couch for 6 weeks with an injury, how on earth am I mentally going to manage that? Because my sport allows me to cope, ultimately.
Yeah, well, again, this is what I found very interesting as well, because I completely identified with this, and I'm sure the people around me who live closely with me would agree, is that you speak about on-season and off-season. So when I can 100% guarantee that I was in a much lower mood during my off-season. And you spoke about when you're not performing and you're not in that environment, the athletes will look for that excitement and that fix on something else. I'm not ashamed to say that, you know, during the off season, it wasn't unrare for me to get into some form of aggressive confrontation when drinking. And it's one of the, you know, that's one of the reasons I don't drink today. But it's so I could completely identify, and this is not just for me, and I'm not going to name any names, but during the off season there would always be some form of trouble with a lot of athletes because they was looking for that fix somewhere else. So when I read that, I was like, right, that's it. You know, that's what a lot of people seem to be doing, is that they're looking for this fix. They need to channel that aggression. You know, you play for, I think we got around about 6 weeks off in the off season where we was told to completely do nothing, maybe do a couple of gym sessions. So we're not completely out of shape, but rest up. But you asking an athlete to rest up for 6 weeks is quite a big ask, really.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, you know, there's all sorts of new research out there now with increasing technology, with neuroimaging. And we know from neuropsychological studies now the impact that dopamine is having on the brain. And the more that we train, the more that we need that dopamine release. So actually, if we use the science to inform and advise our athletes on off-season, we'd be saying you need to actually just be doing a little bit of activity to keep your dopamine levels ticking over. Because it's almost, you know, we talk about addiction as well. It's almost like going cold turkey.
Yeah.
In the brain, you're going cold turkey because that fix that you're getting from your exercise suddenly goes. So we need to think about responsibly advising our athletes on how to manage on and off season and what they need.
I would probably suggest that if I was in a rugby environment now and I was still playing, my off season now, knowing having read that, would probably consist of, for the majority of people, running and lifting weights may be a good substitute. They may get that, but for me, I would probably look at that and think, maybe I need to do like 2 or 3 wrestling sessions, or, you know, get that physical exertion and that aggression work. Because let's be honest, when you're running on a treadmill or you're lifting weights, it's not that competitive. So maybe I needed to like dominate somebody and get into a wrestle with them, or, you know, do some form of physical contact. So knowing what I know now, maybe that's, you know, where some people can channel their aggression.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is the importance of working with a psychologist or an analyst to really understand yourself and what you need, because it's different for everyone. You know, it's about how you relate to yourself internally and then what you're using your sport for. And then if you know what you're using your sport for, you can take care of yourself outside of sport as well. Because
going back to Luke Stoltman about him using the word addiction, and found it fascinating that he doesn't go on holiday because he can't stand the thought of not training, and do you know what? As much as I like going on holiday, one of the first things I always do is go and check out the gym when I'm there. Didn't even realise I was doing it until I'd read that. I thought, I always train when I'm on holiday. I'm there to have 2 weeks off and do nothing and just chill out. But I'm always in the gym when I'm away. I'm always doing some form of training. And, it can be an addiction. And maybe it's, we do approach that coming to the end of a career and sort of treat it like an addiction. And like you say, you wouldn't just stop playing rugby or lifting weights and then it's literally like going cold turkey. So mentally, that must be like really torturous for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, you've brought retirement in. I mean, it's a huge area of need, really, especially because the infrastructure around the athlete as well. If they're a professional athlete, a lot of the athletes then tell me, well, all of my support's gone when I retire. All of these professionals around them that could have helped them, suddenly they've got to fend for themselves as well, and they're really struggling. And there's a few things happening at retirement. I mean, we've spoken about the brain biology, but there's also the fact that retirement is characterized by loss, huge loss. Athletes are doing it earlier than we typically do it in life. Normally we're aiming for about 65 or later nowadays for our generation, but athletes are doing it in their 20s and 30s. They're retiring, and suddenly they've got loss of identity, potentially loss of physical ability because their body's not performing how it used to, potentially loss of a family, loss of a community, loss of friends, loss of financial stability. And suddenly that is a huge psychological adjustment that you have to just manage, and that's an incredible ask. And I mean, the other thing, we've done the brain biology, but analytically as well, if we bring in the psychoanalytic part, I see a lot with sports people that if they have been youth athletes and they've always engaged with sport, there tends to be a pause on development so there's a stage in development in childhood called latency, and that comes before adolescence. And latency is characterized by ordering stuff and control. So, for example, this past weekend, I visited my nephews, outdoor sports, because we have to be outdoors at the moment. So my oldest nephew wanted to play cricket. My youngest nephew wanted to get hold of the cones and line them up in colour and match the hoops to the cones that were lined up. Okay, so they're in very different stages of development, and I'm sure parents will see that. Kids will line up their soft toys or they'll line up their cars. Now, that stage of development is characterized by regime, routine, and order. And you'll know, as a sports person yourself, that's what sport is characterized by. If you've got a coach, they're going to tell you when you're training, what your routine is like that week, what they want you to fuel yourself with and put in your body, and what your lifestyle should look like. Okay, so you shouldn't be going out and drinking every night, and you should be at bed at this time. Okay, so that's characteristic of a certain stage in childhood. And what seems to happen is with certain athletes, there can be a pause on adolescence. Because, of course, what we know adolescence is characterized with is protest and pushing of boundaries and mouthing off about opinions and separating from people. And, of course, I don't know, some coaches might encourage that, but a lot of coaches want to keep their athletes in check because they need them to follow the program. So, of course, at retirement, what we kind of see is suddenly these athletes and sports people are having a delayed adolescence in their 20s and 30s where they're protesting and they're living for the first time. And I think that's why we see a lot of the kind of behaviours that are characterised with alcohol or drugs, because you're getting to do that adolescent experimenting for the first time that you've never been able to do before because you've been given freedom. You haven't got that regime on top of you all the time.
At Get a Tax Rebate, we make it easy for you or your business to claim back thousands of pounds in tax. Most people, like Jane and Philip, don't realise that they are owed money from HMRC, so they never claim. All you need to do is fill out a simple form on our website and we'll do the rest. It's that simple. We've also helped business owners claim back millions of pounds in research and development R&D tax credits. So if you're working in a business or own one, contact us today to see if we can help you claim back tax and improve your cash flow. Get a Tax Rebate, your tax refund concierge.
(1895) Sports and State of Mind, the ultimate lineup.
Macy Vienna Aesthetics, based in Wigan. For all your wrinkle treatments, dermal fillers, lip enhancement, energy boost injections, immune boost injections. Please visit us on Facebook or Instagram at Macy Vienna Aesthetics.
CDX Security, proudly supporting rugby league.
Yeah, no, completely understand that. There's a couple of things that I picked up on there, and again, just going back to myself, really. The way that you said, you know, coaches tell you what to do during the week, and you know, you've got a program, you've got a plan, and you follow it. And just recently, you know, I've realised that during my education, when I'm studying on my own, I have a tutor that I can contact online, and I always feel like I just want them to tell me what to do, then I can do it. You know, and listening to you there it makes me think, yeah, I can understand that, because that's what I'm always used to. I'm always used to a coach saying, "This is your schedule." You know, I left school and worked for 6 months as an engineer and then went into a full-time professional environment when I was 17. So that's basically was my life for, well, it was 20 years, 17 years as a player, and then I did 3 years coaching. And that was literally my life, a schedule. It started off on a piece of paper, but now you've got your iPhone and your schedule's on there. And just listening to you there, I thought, that's sort of another bit of a light bulb moment for me, is why I'm expecting people to tell me what to do, and then I'll just go away and do it, because I've never had an issue with that. And the other thing that I picked up on as well was that the loss as an athlete when you come away from sport, and you mentioned like the financial, the people around you, there's a grieving process in there, and I don't think that way. I think we think grieving's got to be around a living person or an animal or something in that context, but ultimately a loss is a loss, whether that's a career or money, whatever it is, we do have to grieve that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I talk about this in the book, that there is the Kubler-Ross change curve. So it did come from the grief literature. You're right. You know, that's where this all started. But ultimately, it doesn't have to be the loss of a person. It can be the loss of anything in your life. You know, a lot of my work is with individuals with brain injury. And we always have to visit this adjustment curve, because there has been that loss of cognitive functioning and loss of occupation. And in terms of the process, I mean, you know, you go through a stage where at first you're in shock, and at first you're in denial. You don't want to accept that this is happening. But then you can become quite depressed, you can become quite angry, and you have to go through all of those stages. And sometimes you'll oscillate back and forth, but you have to do all of that before you can even think about experimenting with a new way of being and then integrating that into a new way of being. So it's a lengthy process, and that's not going to happen within a matter of weeks. Ultimately, there is that pressure for some athletes to get back out there and to earn and to do this again. And so it's really tough, because that process can take months to years sometimes.
Yeah, no, completely. I'm sorry if I'm turning this into a counselling session for myself, but when I'm listening to it, I'm just like, no, it's taking me back, because I officially retired in 2015, at the end of 2015. And I was lucky that I went into coaching, so I was still involved in rugby league, which was a big part of my life. So I wasn't necessarily mourning that, but I was mourning the fact that I was missing the playing aspect a little bit and that taking that aggression out. So then I went into boxing for 18 months. I had a couple of fights doing that. And then I completely come away from rugby. And like you say, it's a long process, because I also come out of retirement and played rugby again for 4 games in 2018. So from 15 to 18, I've done boxing, I've come back out of retirement, and still looking for this fix, when really ultimately I didn't deal with I didn't go through that grieving process. What I was looking for, is what I'm trying to say, is the substitute for rugby instead of grieving that loss, I suppose. And as much as I didn't really miss playing, that wasn't the biggest aspect that I missed. It was more the lifestyle that I missed, and being around my friends and stuff. But it's an interesting one, the way that you put it there, around the grieving and the loss. And I'm just in a place now. So what we in 2001. So 6 years later, I feel like I'm in a place where I'm comfortable with myself, and I don't miss the playing, that lifestyle. I'm actually comfortable. So it does take a long process.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's really helpful to normalise that as well, because I think a lot of athletes think that they've just got to turn this around really quickly. It is a really long process, and one where it's helpful to get support with that as well. But I don't think athletes know sometimes that there is support available to help with this, because it's not necessarily a diagnosable mental health condition. So where on earth are they meant to go for this? So it's important that they know that there are psychodynamic psychotherapists out there, there are clinical psychologists out there that work in this area, that can help. Because you're right, we see it all the time, don't we? That athletes go from one sport, and if they can't hit peak performance in that sport anymore, they'll step away, and then they'll think, oh, well, I'll try this sport. And then they're kind of repeating that. But ultimately, what needs to happen is that there needs to be some introspection to think about, well, what was my sport giving me? How was it helping me? And what was it that I was using the sport for, that means that I can transition away from this if I want to? We have to acknowledge as well that some sports people don't want to move away. Some sports people don't find it distressing staying in that space. And that's an important part of my work as well. I would only work with people if they're telling me that this is distressing to them. Some people carry on and they'll attack the business world with the same mentality and the same characteristics, and that fuels them and they're really happy, and that's great if that works for them. But this is a discussion about the people that it doesn't work for anymore.
Yeah, completely. It's such a subjective matter, and like some of the conversation, I know some people who have played professional sport and gone on to be very successful in business, and the retirement side of sport has actually not bothered them, and they've been able to channel it. And I think they struggle to empathise when people do struggle. I've struggled, but I've seen people a lot worse than myself. Like I say, I think from reading what you've written and sent me, and what you spoke about today, I think it's that channeling that aggression and that physical contact. And I suppose that masculinity, it's doing that. But I think how I've dealt with that is that I brought a lot of those barriers down now, and I'm actually happy to share my experience in order to help others, and that's what's taken me down the counselling route. So for me now, I know that, and again, it's 6 years ago since I finished, but I'm at a place now where that aggression doesn't serve me anymore. It's actually the opposite. It's showing the vulnerability, it's showing the barriers down and saying, look, this was me as a player, this is where I'm at today, and can I share my experience to help gain you some strength and a bit of wisdom? Because I always refer to it, but a wise man learns from his mistakes, but a wiser man learns from somebody else's mistakes. And that's sort of the mantra that I live by. If I can share my experience and say, look, this is how I did it, but this was very detrimental to me, so shall we have a look at doing it a different way? Then that gives me an ease of satisfaction.
Yeah. And that's incredibly helpful. And I think it feels as if you are learning your own mind through this process, through the past 6 years. And you said earlier about with your counselling, you can see that you're still asking someone how to do it. And that's a hallmark of what adolescence is about as well. It's about protesting and pushing against the other person and saying, I want to find out what my own mind is about. This is why adolescents experiment with dress or how they present, because they're trying to work out their own mind. And there was a chapter in the book that didn't make it, actually, sadly. It was with a professional rugby player. But that was about masculinity, actually, and what he learned through the process of his playing career. And ultimately, it was about that the most helpful part of masculinity wasn't necessarily aggression, but it was working out what that aggression was about and being able to move to an assertive position where he could have his own voice. And that was something that was shut down in sport as well, because in his experience, he didn't feel that he was given a voice. He had to just follow the regime. So if you've done that for 17 years in your experience, and then suddenly you kind of have to stand on your own 2 feet, you also have to find your own mind. And that's a huge process. That takes years as well. So it feels like you've been on an incredible journey, and it's really valuable what you're doing now.
Yeah, it's been incredible, but painful as well. I think that's another one that we need. I think, there's a lot of pain what comes with this, I think. There's the saying is, where there's pain, there's growth. I 100% believe that, and it's, I remember listening to Jordan Peterson a couple of months ago, and he said that, when you're looking at some of this stuff and you've got to let it go, some of it doesn't want to go, some of it wants to stay. And he said, and it burns in agony when you try and get rid of some of these traits. But again, I know that some of these traits no longer serve me, like they did with my rugby league. So there's a change in character. There's got to be a character change, I believe. I'm still myself. I'm still Paul Wood, but I'm just not Paul Wood, the rugby player. I've served to, be another, serve another purpose now. So, but like I said, it's a painful journey, I think, and I think it does scare some people because, like I said, the fact that I'm actually doing some work with current and former professional rugby league players at the minute, I think it scares them, the fact that they change. Because I'm sorry to go on here, I generally, what I see is that some people are successful in sport and say, well, this has served me in sport and been successful, so it will serve me after sport. But it's not necessarily true, is it?
No. Well, I think, like you say, some people can channel it. and they'll find certain environments where it does work. And, you know, you might know that there are talent schemes out there that will try and find sports people to go into the business world because it can work in certain environments. But you're right, in other environments, absolutely not. I mean, if you were going to do the supermarket shopping and you channeled the level of aggression that you channeled on the pitch, I don't think it would go down too well. So you're absolutely right in saying, you know, it's that identity shift, isn't it? You're no longer Paul Wood, the rugby player, but you are Paul Wood. And I think sometimes what we miss is when we're in sport, the sport is our identity, and it becomes so enmeshed with who we are. It's hard to untangle that really and separate the two. But part of the work after retirement is realizing that Paul Wood still exists and the values and the beliefs that he held as a rugby player are still there. That person and those internal qualities still exist. What's lost is just the rugby part. But the good person that's underneath all of it still exists. And that's what we need to return to, that you are more than the sport.
And it's chalk and cheese with my career now, because it's, you know, rugby's one extreme, but like counselling is a completely different set of characteristics. You know, I can't go into a room speaking to someone and be aggressive and be intimidating like you had to be on a rugby field. So two completely different characters, but that is now my passion. You know, that's my passion. That's my, I won't say substitute from rugby, but that's what I've been gravitated to and directed to. So it's, yeah, I think the character change is, it's inevitable for, like you said, some people, they don't need to change because they fall into those environments where those characteristics, it's just for me, like I went into construction as well, and I had my own business, and you know, the straightforwardness and the masculinity and the aggression and stuff probably suited the construction side. And I didn't do too bad out of it, but it just wasn't my passion. So it was never, ever going to work. You know, waking up on a Monday morning and thinking, oh, shit, I've got work now until Friday is never what I had when I played rugby. So it's finding the passion as well that goes with it. And then looking at, well, what characteristics suit this passion that I've now got?
Yeah, it's a really nice way of looking at it, because, you know, whatever we do should be meaningful. We should enjoy it. And I know that sometimes that feels like a privilege, but it should be. We should be aspiring to do things that are meaningful and pleasurable. And I think by saying that you went into construction, again, is really helpful to say that this process takes time. What you're naming there is that part of the grief curve where you have to experiment. That was part of your experimentation when you left rugby. You know, you did coaching for a bit, you then did construction, and now you've found counselling. You know, and I think we just have to give athletes post-retirement permission to experiment and to know that it's going to take time. And just because one of these areas that they go into doesn't necessarily work or it's not the best fit, that doesn't mean it's a failure. That's an incredibly helpful part of the process and the journey of learning about yourself as an adult after sport.
Yeah, and I think, you know, from my experience, it's having that support network around you as well who understand, because a friend of mine, I remember him saying to me last month, said, you've kicked a few tyres, haven't you, since you've retired, to try and see what fits? And I said, yeah, I have. And he understood that. But then there's a lot of people who just think, oh, he's changing from job to job to job. He's never happy. Well, I wasn't happy, but it's about finding that right thing. And, you know, again, speaking to a friend a couple of weeks ago on the phone, and one bit of advice he got from someone he was speaking to is that when you get a job away from rugby, you don't have to stay in it for the rest of your life. You can change as many times as you want, because ultimately you don't know what you're going to be good at. And that is my experience. You know, I'm so glad I didn't have the fear of staying in a job just because I had a job. You know, I wanted to find my passion, and I think that's the ultimate goal for the athletes is, you know, like you said, the word meaningful. It's got to be meaningful to you, like your sporting career was.
Yeah. And I mean, if we try and be compassionate with our retiring athletes as well. I mean, if you think to adolescents when they leave school at 16 or 18, you know, we'd never expect them to suddenly select the job that's going to be the best fit for them for the rest of their lives. You know, we expect them at that developmental stage to experiment and move about a bit until they find something that fits. And it's exactly the same process. It's just that it's being done 10 to 20 years later because of the fact that there's been that sport that's delayed that. So I think we just need to be quite compassionate and say, you know, we're going to experiment and it's going to take some time, and that's incredibly healthy.
Glad you said that, because I sometimes refer myself back to a 16-year-old. You know, I do. You know, even though I'm 39 now, 40 this year, and I sometimes refer myself back, I feel like a 16-year-old kid again. You know, and that's it. It does feel like that. So it's great to hear you say that. Just before we wrap it up, I think it's important as well just to touch on the fact that, you know, and you state this in your book, that you're not saying sport can create mental health issues at all. It's just that there are some extreme characteristics that are in there, and, you know, that there's a fine line between that.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you bringing that, actually, because I don't want this message to be misunderstood, really. You know, I'm a huge fan of sport. I continue to be active and engaged in the sporting world, and it's an incredible thing for our physical health and our mental health. But I'm not suggesting that sport is a bad thing and that it creates mental illness at all. The book is a real analysis of what's going on here in sporting culture and how can we understand it. And that's not about blaming anyone. It's not about blaming the individual, blaming the coaches or the organizations. It's about saying, how have we found ourselves here and what can we learn from it? And if we can learn from it, how can we better support our athletes, not just to be better athletes, but better people as well.
No, that's brilliant. It's outstanding. You know, I like the last bit that you said, becoming better people, you know, and that's ultimately the goal. I think sport does that. I think it brings a lot of great characteristics out in people. That's why I love my kids playing sport now, because, you know, they learn the discipline, they learn, you know, how to work with others. There's so many positives to sport. But yeah, it's been a great chat. I could chat all day about this subject. It's really good, but I really appreciate you coming on, Amy.
Yeah, thanks ever so much for the invite. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah.
No worries, thank you.